Buenas noches, everybody. What a beautiful gathering of people. Look at all these look at these heads in the Zoom room. Oh man. Well, I want to say my name is Josiah Alderete, and I want to very much welcome you all to City Lights Live, which is the virtual reading series that continues in the footsteps of City Lights Bookstore is in-store calendar during the shelter-in-place pandemico that we are all going through. Though we are unable to hold events at the store, we continue to celebrate the works of authors that we know and love with online readings, discussions, and forums throughout the month of August and into the fall. For those of you that don't know, let me just say that we are very feliz, very proud, very excited to say that City Lights has finally reopened its doors to the public. We're following very strict San Francisco Health Department guidelines. We got the mask requirements and the cleaning your hands at the door, and we got people watching the distancing and everything. So please come in and visit us if you're around. We do miss you. The store misses you. Yeah, come on back. Come on back. Our business hours are going to be 7 days a week from 12 to 8 p.m. And like I said, we're real excited about reopening. So I hope to see you all soon, very soon. And but for tonight, man, we've got something very special for you all planned. Also, I do want to remind you all that City Lights, in addition to being a bookstore, is also a publishing house. Yes, it's true, man. And this year we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the beloved Spotlight Poetry Series that City Lights started following the grand tradition of Lawrence Ferlinghetti's Pocket Poet Series. And we're really excited about two new books that have come out, Uchi Nudaka's new book, as well as Sophie Dalin. Look at this, huh? Look at these beautiful books. And the additional upcoming titles are very excited about the ex-poet of Los Estados Unidos, Juan Felipe Herrera's book is coming out by City Lights, as well as Caribbean Fragosas and Seshu Foster's as well. So we're real excited. And also retargeting Iran has just come out, as well as No Fascist USA by Hillary Moore and James Tracy. So to learn more about our books, go to www.citylights.com. And you can also visit us on all those social media places, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. But like I said earlier, tonight's a very special event. Man, we are celebrating Anarcho-Blackness, Notes Towards a Black Anarchism, published by AK Press. And we're extremely honored to have with us tonight in a Zoom room the author of this book, Marquis Bey, joined in conversation with Andrew Cutrone. So for those of you that don't know, Marquis Bey is an assistant professor of African American literature and English at Northwestern University. And Andrew Cutrone is beginning his PhD in sociology at the University of Texas in Austin. He's interested in critical pedagogy and Black studies, specifically in mobilizing Black feminism to disrupt normative processes of self and world making. His writing focuses on accomplices and accomplice work constituted through Black feminist anarchism. A review that Andrew wrote of Anarcho-Blackness, Notes Towards a Black Anarchism, is forthcoming in Social Text Web. Keep your eyes out for that. And people, I want you to know that we're going to be having a Q&A at the end of this very, very cool discussion between these two folks. So if you have any questions for either Andrew or Marquis, excuse me, please put the question in the chat function and I will read them to them at the end of the session. And also, remember, we're a bookstore, so if you can, buy some books from us. We're going to be posting a link to be able to buy this book in the chat throughout the reading series, so every little book helps. Just want to put that out there. All right, y'all, that's enough of me talking. Without further ado, please give a warm Zoom room welcome. Give them jazz hands and everything for the gentlemen of the evening, Marquis Bey and Andrew Cutrone.
Thank you, Josiah. How you doing today, Marquis? What's going on? What's going on?
Wonderful. I'm not sure if I can use profanity on this. I imagine I can, but just to be safe, I'm not going to do that. So yeah, I can. So I'm in fucking Kansas, not Kansas. I'm in South Dakota right now, and I'm on a road trip, and you will not believe the shit I've seen. My goodness, it is. We can get into that later, but I am in a very interesting place right now, but I'm going to be having a very interesting discussion with you about Blackness, anarchism, Black feminism, gender non-normativity,
Yeah,
all these wonderful, wonderful things. So I
yeah.
am well. How are you, Andrew?
I'm doing okay. I myself am in Houston, Texas, by way of Long Island, New York. Just got off a nice long road trip, and I've been enjoying the 100+ weather,
Goodness, no.
for the last month or so. Yeah, it's been interesting, but my Texas people know what that feels like. And Marquis, I wanted to be the first one to say, I'm hoping that everybody in the chat got a chance to read your book, but it was just excellent, super duper excellent. I had the opportunity to write a review, which I proudly have beside me to reference, and I really look forward to asking you some questions and to really just having a good conversation. So
Likewise.
super duper excited.
Mm-hmm.
I did have a question if you're ready to get started.
Of course, let's go.
Yeah, so let's start with the title of the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's Anarcho-Blackness, Notes Toward a Black Anarchism.
Mm-hmm.
And the a Black Anarchism could one could understand that to mean that there are multiple kinds of Black anarchisms, one of which being Anarcho-Blackness. And one of the central arguments of the book is that, Black anarchism is, Anarcho-Blackness is anarchic precisely because it's constituted through Black trans feminist thought.
Mm-hmm.
But perhaps you're alluding to the fact that there are many other kinds of Black anarchism. So I just would love to open up the conversation in hearing about how you distinguish your understanding of Anarcho-Blackness from other kinds of Black anarchisms that might exist.
For sure. And like a very astute observation as to the function or the way that the A is operating in that. Because I'm very uninterested in claiming a monopoly on the correct version or the most valid version of Black anarchism, because other people have, this is not also to devolve into a kind of relativism. Anyone's Black anarchism is validly considered Black anarchism. I'm less interested in that and much more interested in the way that there's a capaciousness in my understanding of Black anarchism, that it can look like different things, and it's precisely a function of Black anarchism that it can look like different things. There's a kind of malleability there, or in many ways a kind of non-normativity that is able to circulate and flex and bend in different ways that do not necessarily have to look the same in all contexts. And I think that is what could perhaps give it a certain kind of purchase or a utility, perhaps, precisely because it can be malleable in certain ways. But I use Anarcho-Blackness instead of, say, a more expected Black anarchism, not only because the Black Rose Anarchist Federation has literally a kind of booklet called Black Anarchism, but primarily because I am interested in thinking about, so if you have someone like a historian Carl Levy, who's a historian of anarchism, how he utilizes a kind of definition of anarchism through the suffix, the ism, which then denotes a kind of, here are the parameters of anarchism. Here is like when it began as an organization, an identifiable political movement with these people, these predecessors, these texts, doctrines, all that kind of stuff. I'm less interested in that. And there's, of course, utility in that. It gives a kind of legibility to anarchism.
Yeah.
I'm less interested in that and much more interested in the anarcho, which for me etymologically alludes to a kind of statelessness, or as the anarchist phrase goes, no gods, no masters. I'm interested in the anarcho because it alludes to a certain kind of modality or way of inhabiting the world, way of existing within the world in relation to other people, that is less concerned about adhering to specific tenets of what is called anarchism, and much more interested in how can I do anarchic work? How can I deploy my subjectivity in ways that undermine coercion, hierarchy, authority, the state, etc. So the anarcho gives a certain kind of malleability and also non-normativity and flexibility to my understanding, my conception of Black anarchism that might not be, in my estimation, captured by a phrase like Black anarchism. Yeah.
Totally. As always, you give me so much to chew on and think about. And so what I'm thinking about is anarcho as being this prefixal deployment to Blackness, right? And so I think that, right, I mean, so much of this conversation could be about how you and I and we understand Blackness, right? This is a very, I don't want to say specific, which is to say limited, right? It's specific in its capaciousnness, right? In its very broad understanding of what Black is, what Blackness is as a modality of living, right? As a way of thinking, that anarchism modifies, right? And so, right, I would just love to have a conversation about Blackness, right, and talk about the folks that influence our understandings, right? Because I've learned so much of my understanding of Blackness has come from you, right? And by way of you, I've gotten introduction to folks like Hortense Spillers, folks like Fred Moten, Saidiya Hartman, Nam Chandler, Denise Ferreira da Silva, right? All these tremendous, wonderful people, wonderful scholars. But my understanding is that by and large, they haven't necessarily attended to the anarchic resonances of Blackness in the way that you have. So maybe we can first start by talking about those folks, and then maybe talk about the way that you've intervened in those conversations through anarchism.
Yeah, okay. Where to start? So yeah, you named all the heavy hitters for me. Hortense Spillers, Fred Moten, Denise Ferreira da Silva, Saidiya Hartman. I would also add like Christina Sharp in that. These people, Nam Chandler, are absolutely foundational and formative for my understanding of Blackness. So let me back up just a little bit. So in the opening of the book, I try to make clear in a way that's gentle, yet that also gets across my frustration. I write a lot out of frustration. A lot of my writing comes from, I was frustrated by something someone said, something someone did. I got annoyed by this thing, and then I wrote this whole thing in response to it. I'm very discursively passive aggressive, I guess. There's a growing frustration for me the way that sometimes in Black studies, the work being done is simply a finger pointing. And mind you, let me just make clear that we need the finger pointing because some things really, really need to be pointed out in kind of given a talking to, as it were. But I am much less interested in that move as Black studies or as a correct or valid or the understanding of how we might say what either Black anarchism is or Black feminism or etc. So I'm much less interested, as I note in the outset of the book, in this finger pointing, and much less interested in deeming Black anarchism simply a compilation of all the Black people who have identified themselves as anarchists. Not really interested in that. In part because other people have already done that work to great effect, wonderful. But mostly because it's, to be honest, just a boring move to me. I'm much, much more interested in how Blackness ushers in a reconfigurative project, how it necessitates a paradigmatic and fundamental shift of the very tenets upon which we operate. That's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in simply slotting in Black faces to the existing representational logics or paradigms that we have. I'm interested in how Blackness necessarily or necessitates the shattering of those very logics themselves. That's my understanding of anarchism. Like, how can we think about the ways that, one, these very logics and representational figures, templates, and all that are predicated upon, constituted by the very exclusion of Blackness, which then means that if Blackness were to enter into the frame, which it already in all ways has entered into the frame, it necessarily shatters that frame. I'm interested in what those shattered pieces look like. How can we then think about, because as Bakunin would say, phenomenal anarchist, as Bakunin would say, anarchism is not simply a destructive process, but a creative one as well. So we're shattering these tenets, these frameworks, and all that. Wonderful. What then can we create or make in the ashes of this world, of these various kinds of paradigms that we have just shattered? That's what I'm interested in, and that's the work to me of Blackness. It's a modality of subversion. It's a kind of it's an opposition, as Kathy Cohen would say, in terms of her understanding of queerness and Black feminism. It's an oppositional relation to power that is not simply about in terms of Blackness, not simply about a somatic endowment, but rather is about a way of relating to the various mechanisms that instill or instantiate what is normal, what is typical, what is right, correct, all these kind of things. That's my understanding of Blackness. So by way of Kathy Cohen, by way of someone like Fred Moten, by way of people like Hortense Spillers, and I can quote all of them too. I'm not going to do that to y'all, but I just recommend you read their work. I just recommend people read their work. But actually, no, let me just throw out some quotes real quick. So if someone like Fred Moten says in his 2008 article, Black Op, that anyone whom Blackness claims, which is to say everyone, can claim Blackness, that then makes Blackness not simply about this thing that I possess via my identity, but rather it is an ethical commitment to doing subversive work in what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney would call the undercommons, or if we go the route of Hortense Spillers, in the introduction, page 5 actually, of her essay collection, yes, in her reading of Ralph Ellison, that Blackness is a kind of philosophical disobedience or a systematic skepticism that can be claimed by anyone willing to do the work of invention. That is how we're understanding Blackness here. That is a way of not simply a racialized identity, which is not at all to be undermined or not at all to be deemed as not important, but rather it is how can we think about ways of precisely getting outside of these very categories that were bestowed via white cis masculine supremacy. These categories are nevertheless bestowals that are effectively non-consensual bestowals. So they are impositions onto us. How can we think about ways of radically in many ways abolishing these kinds of violences, if the violence of categorization, the violence of normativity, how can we get outside of those and undermine and subvert those things? That is how I'm understanding Blackness, and that is how I'm then understanding the anarchicness, as it were, of Blackness and the Blackness of anarchism via that kind of modality of thinking about one's relation to the world, one's relation to normativity, one's relation to the state, which is both an institution as well as a relation, thinking about all those things and how we might become more unviolated or instill and instantiate unviolated life. Okay, I'll end there. I have a tendency to ramble and go off on things, but I'll just end it there so you can ask other questions and we can get at other different kinds of things.
No, it's kind of cool that there are other people that are listening to this besides me. I would love to, not that it's my call right now, but I would love to be like, oh my God, does anybody else have anything to say about this? Because
we can do that in the Q&A. We can do that in the Q&A.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. For sure. What you're talking about is really, really exciting, and it provides to me so much insight as well as so much calm,
Mhm.
as it were, even though what you're proposing and what you're building in this work is very unsettling, right? Definitionally very unsettling. It's providing me a sense of calm, because the thing for me right now that is the most unsettling is what's going on directly through all of these different impositions of normativity and hegemony that are scaring the hell out of me. And so something like Anarcho-Blackness, the way that Blackness is conceptualized by way of people like Moten and Spillers, is, at least the way I'm interpreting it, offering me a different way of existing in the world, right? That isn't circumscribed through whiteness, through an uncritical cisgender supremacy, through an uncritical masculinity or patriarchy, heteronormative patriarchy, right? What you're offering for all kinds of folks is, on the one hand, a really succinct understanding of Blackness and feminism and transness, but also you're proposing a kind of way out for people for whom, white, cis, hetero modalities of living are just not it. If that makes sense. And so I think that is, I think, the way in which I best relate to the work.
And it's if I may real quick, and it's a way out that's not a cop out either, right? It's
right.
A way out that is an ethical demand to be, as Moten would say, impoverished in the spirit. So how can we not simply give people who, I need to be very careful with my words, who are said to adhere or are said to be a part of these hegemonic normative identities, it gives them not a way out to simply say, I am not this thing and I don't have to be that thing, but a way to do the work of disavowing the violences that inhere in that very identity. And how can we then, it's an ethical demand. It's very much an ethical demand. How can you or are you willing to be in the struggle with as I'm quoting a lot of people just because I have read and love a lot of people. For me, it's not name dropping, but it's a citational practice. So someone like Robin D.G. Kelly, how can we be in community, in loving community with the misfits, or the people, the denigrated, the thrown away, the cast out, the refuse? How can we be in solidarity, in coalition with those people? And that is very much kind of undercommon work, to use Moten Harney's language. That is the work of accomplices, the work of the fugitive. All these things are ways of committing to a certain kind of work rather than doubling down on a purported possessed identity, which is so uninteresting to me, uninteresting to me. I'm much more interested in how people put in certain kinds of work in order to bring about, in service of certain kinds of aims and a certain kind of understanding of the world. That's what I'm interested in. And that's how I am thinking about Blackness, how I'm thinking about Black feminism, how I'm thinking about trans theorizing. All these things are embedded in modes of existing in and deploying oneself in and via the world. And in some ways in subversion and undermining of various aspects of the world, insofar as the world itself is this normative concept that we also must undermine in a variety of ways.
Right. Oh my gosh. I have so many questions. Right. So I would love to talk about, maybe we can make like a little schedule of things to talk about before we run out of time, right?
All right, cool.
So first I would like to talk about the undercommons. And then I would love to talk about this thing called the world, right? This conception of the world and how we can define it, right, appropriately, or how we can theorize it. what it is, how it gets made, right? And then think about some alternative possibilities through anarcho-blackness, right? Or I think of somebody like Shay Gosset's recent tweet. They said, the world is what happened when the earth gets, the world is what happens when the earth becomes private property.
Ooh.
I'm paraphrasing to a certain extent, but that was the essence of the tweet. And I had been working on this project for a little while that I've put down because, you know, certain things in my life have come up, but thinking very squarely about that dialectic between the earth and the world, right? So maybe we can talk about that a little bit and the certain kinds of forces that constitute each of them and how we can, as fast as we can, get away from the world and start building as sustainable of an earth as we can in the time that we got left, you know, working under this kind of duress that we're facing. So maybe we can do that.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it's also, and then I have a couple of other things, but let's see if we can get to it or not. I would like to maybe kind of pivot a little bit to talking about the undercommons. But I would like to do so, if you're all right with it, if I could read a little bit, just like half a paragraph of what I wrote in my review, forthcoming in social text. Okay.
Go for it.
Anarcho-Blackness, in so many words, must be monstrously inclusive. Here, Bey takes critical generative cue from Moten and Harney, who, quote, insist that our radical politics, our anarchic world building must be unconditional. The door swings open for refuge, even though it may let in police agents and destruction. The only ethical call that could bring about the radical revolutionary overturning we seek is one that does not discriminate or develop criteria for inclusion and consequently exclusion. Blackness, therefore, radicalizes the logics of inclusion to include anyone, not just those who satisfy any particular phenotypic or epidermal criteria, or who walk beyond any institutional gates. Blackness, then, is a mood or a style or a way of being in the world that indexes not impositions or normativities or hegemonies, but expansive conceptions of freedom, coalition, being, and belonging. Conceptions sustained against the differentiated individuators' hegemonies, cisnormative, white supremacist, neoliberal capitalism. Okay. And so what we were talking about earlier when you were referencing Kathy Cohen's great work is what I kind of hear as being, as engaging in a political praxis that is both critical, but that is also generative. And so when I was writing this, I wanted to kind of identify some certain underlying forces going on in anarcho-blackness, which is, on the one hand, this radical penchant for being absolutely critical of these worldly forces and formations of whiteness and normative heteropatriarchy, cisgender supremacy, right? But it's also super generative on the other hand, right? It proposes and actively works on building a new world that isn't necessarily concerned with or that builds itself in spite of the world, right? So anarcho-blackness reins in or rather allows for kind of black transfeminism to do the work that it does, right? Unconcerned with what the world tries to kind of impose on it. And so I was wondering, I was wondering how all of this kind of hits your ear, and then if you could comment a little bit on a kind of dual nature of anarcho-blackness as both a critical and a generative formation.
Absolutely. So the notion of like this is from the undercommons. The door swings open even if it may let in police agents. Like when I reread the undercommons, I had to stop at that line. It really, really got to me. It struck me initially as deeply, deeply wrong-headed, deeply problematic. But I don't know if we are going to commit, and these are still like thoughts in process for me, as all my thoughts are really. But if we are going to be, if we're going to attempt to bring about abolition, if we are committed to abolition, and I mean a radical abolition, not a half-ass abolition, but abolition, the instantiation of a world that deems, or the instantiation of a world that makes impossible the very existence of carceral logics. If we understand that as abolition, then it's going to be scary as hell, like really, really terrifying, absolutely terrifying. We're going to have to let go of a whole bunch of shit that we didn't think we were going to have to let go of. And a lot of that is stuff that we have deep affective ties to. So what would it mean then for it to be conceivable that an abolitionist mode of living might have to be radically non-exclusionary, radically inclusive, to the extent that it may let in people we might deem as, say, white, or might deem as people who are or have been affiliated with the state? What would it mean to let them in, not simply as kind of portention of our destruction, but as a radical commitment to the possibility that this person might be otherwise than they are, might be otherwise than they've been told they must be? That is, to me, that's the call of abolition. And for me, it's very much the call of the anarcho, call of the anarchic, because it is an attempt to bring about a certain kind of statelessness, which is, again, not simply an institution, but in addition to that, an institution that violently doles out skewed life chances, all these things. But it's also a relation. It is very much about the way we relate to one another. How can we relate to one another on stateless grounds, on grounds that do not necessitate that one must adhere to, say, the gender binary, must adhere to the various ways that genders are circumscribed and conscripted, must adhere to the ways that that one's physiognomic reading necessitates, does not ascribe to any of those kind of things. What would it mean to do that, to think about how we might exist with one another on those radically stateless grounds? That is, to me, the commitment of the anarchic, the commitment of anarcho-blackness, precisely because it then requires that we radically undermine the various ways that we've been governed to behave and to think, to comport ourselves in relation to the world and one another, and ideas, knowledge, all of that. It requires a radical reconfiguration and abolition even of those kinds of things as well. So for me then, the anarcho, the anarchic is about not only destroying or obliterating or abolishing or getting rid of those violent grounds on which we predicate our very relationship to the world and reality even, but about creating different ways to think about what it means to exist, the different ways to think about what it means for something to be real and possible. All of that is the radical imagination of abolition of anarchism. And I am deeply committed to that. And it's very difficult, I know. I constantly fail at that, which sounds cliche, I know, but it's very, very true, because it's difficult, because we constitute ourselves via all of these kinds of logic. I know myself and what exists via those logics that we are attempting to undermine and eradicate. So to do something radically different means that I am venturing into literally uncharted territory, unreal and impossible territories. But that impossibility might very well be the only possibility we have for sustaining life, for even permitting life that is deemed to not be life, permitting that life to live, and also to permit the very kinds of life and livelihood that aren't even deemed life to emerge into the world unfettered by all these circumscriptions. That is what it means for me to do anarchic work, to generate the possibility for the emergence of queer existence, by which I mean existence that is not deemed as existence as such. How can we create and cultivate the condition for that very possibility, which is deemed as an impossibility, but how can we commit to that impossibility? And that is also what I'm getting at via, say, trans theorizing via someone like Dean Spade. If trans people are in one sense deemed as impossible people, okay, cool. Let's actually take that seriously. What does it mean then to be to commit to the livability and the emergence of the impossible? That to me is the radical work that I'm called to do, constantly called to do. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Yeah, and I think that does answer the question.
Definitely does.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
It definitely does.
Mm-hmm.
Just, it's so funny. Every time that, you know, we speak, I always leave, you know, not with, you know, I leave just enlightened and enlivened and, you know, a variety of different emotions right now, for sure.
Of course, of course.
Oh goodness. I would like to talk about citational practice, I guess we can call it, and who we write for. Who are we bringing along with us when we write? I think of somebody like Hortense Spillers, right? I was just listening to her talk with Alexis Pauline Gumbs.
Yes, yes.
At the very end of which Spillers was like, disagreed with Gumbs to a certain extent, and said, you know, something to the effect of, let's say Thomas Jefferson.
I know the quote. I know the quote you're getting at. So if you don't remember it, I got you.
Come here. You're gonna play over here.
Yes.
You're gonna exist on my terms, in my imagination. You're gonna be subjected to my thinking, to my fire.
Yes, 100%. Hortense Spillers, everything she said is literally gold. So just yes to Hortense Spillers.
And so thinking through and with, right, not necessarily about, but thinking with Hortense Spillers when we think about our citational practice. What does it mean to you to invoke these various classical anarchists who, as you say, weren't concerned with Blackness, didn't bring Blackness to bear on their thinking, or who weren't necessarily concerned with gender, didn't theorize how gender factored into their theories of the state and to power and authority? Were you thinking about Spillers when you made that kind of intellectual move? And if so, could you say a little bit more about that? I'm really, really curious.
100%, yes. I know exactly the moment you're talking about in that conversation between Hortense Spillers and Alexis Pauline Gumbs, because Alexis, and I know Alexis, and I've met Hortense Spillers, so I apologize if I'm using first names. I trust that it's coming from a kind of genuine place. But so Alexis was noting how for her it's a kind of ethical practice to only, or at least primarily, cite Black women.
Yeah.
Wonderful, fine. Hortense Spillers, as you alluded to, Andrew, kind of disagreed with that and said, I'll cite anybody, but they're going to be mine when I'm finished with them. And that is yes to that, because there's so often, there's a way that citational practices and like calls to say, cite Black women, for example, are absolutely key and crucial and necessary and well-meaning, all that wonderful positive stuff. And I absolutely do not want to say that is not a valiant and valid and necessary thing to do. It is, full stop. In addition to that, there's a way that sometimes the citation of other people, or even people that often go cited, is deemed as not either radical enough or they're not
Mm-hmm.
proper objects of citation for this thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm quite promiscuous with my citational practices. And it's precisely because I refuse to allow, say, Hortense will use the example of Thomas Jefferson. So I refuse to allow like Thomas Jefferson or these classical anarchists to be static or fixed. To me, they're always open to being revised and revised on terms not of their own making, revised on terms actually contrary to their terms sometimes. So I oftentimes want to, if I'm, say, citing Bakunin or someone, or Kropotkin or Emma Goldman, I'm actually not simply taking what they said, putting this in my thing, and it's existing as it is. There's a necessary shift in what that thing can mean, what is possible for this thing to mean and do. How can I make someone like Bakunin do work for me rather than on his own terms? That to me is quite, I don't know if I want to say radical, or just quite cool to me, that these figures are not destined to simply be themselves, but there's an excess there. They can exist in excess of themselves in a way that serves my ends, and in a way that can kind of do a different kind of work that might even undermine the thing that they said. So yes, I was very much thinking about Hortense Spiller with that, precisely because if I'm going to be engaging with anarchism, and if I'm going to trying to be thinking about what might be called Black anarchism, that requires a necessary engagement with these classical anarchist figures, many of whom, like Max Godwin was, or no, that's William Godwin. Max Stirner was deeply, deeply sexist. Like that man was problematic as shit. So what do I do with that? Like, what do I do with that? Because not every anarchist is going to be my best friend. Many of them are not going to be my best friend. So how can I mobilize them in a way that does not simply rehash what they said or think? So I might think about them, or think alongside them, think with them, and maybe point out their shortcomings, or even if not simply pointing out their shortcomings, but thinking about how I can use the very thing that they said in order to proffer a different kind of claim about the thing that they're talking about. And that to me is quite generative for conversation, quite generative for thinking about what else can be done with anarchism. It's not destined to being couched in a certain kind of whiteness. It's open to being revised in ways that are in service of a certain conception of radicalizing it via Blackness. Yeah, I'll cite anybody. I really genuinely will cite anybody, but they are not going to simply exist on their own terms once they are cited by me or by someone else, because the context and the way that they're deployed can be altered in ways that are in service of radically different ends, perhaps. Yeah.
Awesome. That's great. That's great. That's awesome. I wanted to think a little bit about, because it was one of the genuine questions that I did have about the book, right? You kind of revealed to us pretty late in the game that when you were speaking about abolition, right? Specifically when you were theorizing Anarcho-Blackness's embeddedness or constitutiveness with abolition. Almost to the point where the anarchic mode could very easily be a synonym to an abolitionist mode. And so I was genuinely kind of struggling with how to think about the anarcho or the anarchic in relation to the abolitionist or in relation to abolition, and how you kind of understand them on their own in relation to one another, and how you see their commingling to be a productive one. There's no doubt in my mind that their commingling is and can only be a productive commingling. But I'm curious about the extent to which you envision that commingling, that intermingling, that conversation between the very real and very pertinent conversation that a lot of folks are having around abolition right now, and how that kind of figures into your understanding of what is anarchic as well as in anarcho-blackness.
Yeah, for sure. So it'll be helpful for me to try to clearly define each of these and then think about the way that they relate to or don't relate to one another. So anarchism, for me, is very much predicated on three particular tenets, and all the various strains of anarchism might have different ways of going about these tenets, but for me, there's a kind of thread of these three tenets of anti-statism, anti-authoritarianism, and direct participation. And direct participation, very much the various rules, ethics that will, I use govern advisedly here, but that will govern a certain population or certain people, should be formulated by and decided on those very people for whom it is effective. So direct participation is one strand of this. Anti-authoritarianism is very much a commitment to a non-hierarchical relationality. It's a commitment to refusing forms of coercion, hierarchy, violence, anything that speaks to some kind of top-down or speaks to someone or someone's deciding the fate of the masses or other people. And then anti-statism is, as I noted throughout this conversation, is not simply about a refusal of the state as its entity or institution, not simply about the institution that is doling out violence via poverty, via incarceration, all these things, but also about a kind of relation, how the state in its logics very much seep into the very ways we relate to people. So the example I always come to is like how when we're talking about either romantic relationships or friendships, we think about investing our time, which is very capitalistic state language. How can we then destate our relation to one another and other people? So that's how I'm understanding the state and being anti-state. That's my understanding of anarchism in a very, very brief, shallow nutshell. Abolition, I get all of my knowledge of abolition from people like Angela Davis, of course, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Miriam Kaba, and even Fred Moten and Stephen Harney, and Saidiya Hartman too. All these people are understanding abolition not simply as the getting rid of the bad stuff, getting rid of prisons or private prisons, getting rid of those things. And once we get rid of those things, we're all good. That is not entirely what abolition is, but rather the creation of a society in which prisons, and I would extend that to the very logics of carcerality, are impossible. How can we create a society in which it is impossible to interact with people on carceral logics? That is abolition. It's the creation of a society rather than the elimination of things that are already in the society, which presumes then that this society is all good, but for these various bad apples, as it were. So that's how I'm understanding each of these things. I think what abolition provides or gives to anarchism, which is not to say that it's non-existent in anarchism, but what I think abolition provides is this attention to carcerality, this attention to the ways that various logics, various ways of thinking and living and relating to people operate oftentimes on ways of capturing or circumscribing the flourishing of life, the flourishing of other people's subjectivity, life, etc. So say trans antagonism is a kind of carcerality because it circumscribes various ways, it circumscribes the ways that people might variously express or understand their own or gender in itself. So that's kind of carceral logic in a way that abolition does that in a way that I don't always get or rarely get from anarchism, even though someone like Emma Goldman was very, very much a prison abolitionist, like very much so. She said, I think, I'm going to botch the quote, but she says something to the effect of, how is prison a remedy to social ills? You might as well say that cancer, you might as well say that you can be cured by a widespread cancer. So this way of, like, there are pockets of this thinking in anarchism, but for me, abolition makes plain and apparent and explicit the ways that carcerality is infused within our society. So there are differences there, but they converge in some really fundamental ways for me in their commitment to alternative forms of life, their commitment to thinking about how can we live life unfettered by various modes of captivity. This is me understanding, this is my understanding of Black feminism via someone like Jennifer Nash as an anti-captivity project. How can we think about our ways of relating, ways of living as inspired by and infused with bringing about anti-captivity? How can we refuse to capture, circumscribe people's existence and the excesses of normativity? That is, to me, where these two things converge, which is why Black feminism and trans feminism are constitutive of the anarcho-Blackness for me, precisely because I get a lot of this from the way that Black feminism via Nash is a kind of anti-captivity project, and via folks in trans studies, Susan Stryker, C. Riley Snorton, Shay Gossett, these people understand transness as a staunch commitment to refusing to allow or refusing to force people to adhere to violent normative logics of binaries, of expression of possibility for subjective expression, or ways of interacting with people, ways of curtailing or corralling or understanding desire. All those things are constitutive of my way of understanding anarcho-Blackness, and which is then constitutive of or constituted by my understanding of anarchism and abolition as converging in some really key and fundamental ways.
Awesome. Well, the thing, and I think we might be wrapping up, but the one thing that I, kept coming back to when you mentioned, someone like Jennifer Nash's concept of Black feminism as a formation of anti-captivity. In addition to Black trans feminism, which is something that you've thought a whole lot about, right? These are ways, as Manolo Callahan, as I learned, Manolo Callahan said by way of Fred Moten, these are ways of walking more lightly on the earth.
Yes.
Right. These are ways of potentially saving the earth by being less violent to the earth and its inhabitants, including ourselves, if we are to be so individuated about it. But I know we might want to hold off on that for now.
Yeah. So let's open it up to questions. I know there are questions out there for folks, but also I want to thank you, Andrew, for these lovely, wonderful questions and just the conversation. We've had many of these conversations before, but I also just want to thank you publicly for the conversation, because this has been like really generative for me as well. I'm not simply gifting people with information, but I'm very much in conversation and community and coalition with all the people on this call right now. So thank you, Andrew, and thank you all for being on this call. So let's open it up to questions.
Hey, y'all, give it up for these two amazing people here. That's beautiful. Yeah, we do have some questions. Andrew, thank you so much for that interview, that conversation was man. When is the review going to come out? It mentioned it's going to be in the social text web. When can we expect it?
So I'm currently in conversation with the senior editor as well as the web editor. We've been in conversation for the last couple of weeks.
Okay.
I'm waiting to hear back any day now.
Cool. All right. Well, we do definitely have some questions from the audience. Cornelius asks, do you think the movement demand for defunding the policia and for promoting mutual aid and Black politics is an expression of anarchism?
Okay. So yes and no. Yes, because Because the police are trash, and I'm not even qualifying that. Police are just trash. And so yes, in the sense that for me, any attempts to mitigate the reach of law enforcement, which is one of the primary limbs of the violence of the state, any attempts to mitigate that, to me, is a kind of anarchic move. It's an attempt to become less committed to or less indebted to the state. But I say no only because of the language of defunding. So there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of debates in terms of defunding over abolition of the police, and there's a lot of that out there. And for me, I'm very much all about abolition in every realm, like every realm. So defunding the police, I think, is not at all unimportant. It's, I think, actually a necessary step toward the abolition of the police. I think one of my fears is that the defunding becomes the end in itself, and I want the defunding to be in service of the abolition. So I want that to be a stepping stone in the getting to the abolition of the police. But overall, yes, absolutely, 100%. It is an expression of anarchism, precisely because it is attempting to extricate ourselves from the state in whatever way we can. And law enforcement, the police, are a huge extension of the violence of the state. So 100%, yeah.
Okay. And Alexander was wondering, how do you, if you do at all, wrestle with the tension between establishing, imagining, bringing about an anarchistic perspective, and doing so in a way that pays particular attention to the concept of blackness? Does not blackness itself trap us into situating ourselves upon a foundation which is itself normative and subsequently non-anarchistic?
Yeah. So the reason why I'm committed. So there's a distinction here in thinking about blackness between, I'm going to try not to get too academic, but I'm going to do it real quick because I'm going to trust that folks can think, and also, if they have not encountered this language before, are committed to either looking up or asking further questions. Please email me if you want to, if you need to define some of these things. But so with that said, there's a distinction to be made here between what's denoted as a para-ontological understanding of blackness, or a way of thinking about blackness in excess of an ontological bestowal, and then what Denise Ferreira da Silva calls in her book, Toward a Global Idea of Race, a categorical blackness. That categorical blackness is a kind of racial identity of being African American, being part of the African diaspora. That, to me, is not how I'm simply understanding blackness. I'm thinking about it in the former sense of a kind of para-ontological way, which necessarily gets us out of the normative register of simply adhering to the categories that we have and then genuflecting really to those categories. I don't want to do that. I'm not interested in doing that. So the way that I'm thinking about anarchism as it relates to blackness is via that, and then necessarily a commitment to not simply, but also not doing this, not simply about a fidelity to people who are deemed as black, deemed as sufficiently black, not simply a fidelity to those people and whatever those struggles are, which are various and numerous, but rather a way of thinking about how we can see what power is doing to whom, and how we can attend to those demographics, those populations, in service of eradicating the very thing that has imposed and instilled this condition. So it's less about this particular demographic, and much more about how can we think about the conditions that allow for, how can we think about what permitted the condition for this demographic to be in this position, and then think about how we can eradicate those modes of power, which will then effectively, as the Combahee River Collective says in their Black feminist statement, which will then effectively mean that we are eradicating all the violences, or many of the violences, that betide various other people. So it's it's capacious by way of a certain kind of specificity. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in we need to free or think about this certain demographic, but it's always in service of these systems and these modes of power that are in actuality not simply affecting this particular population, but affecting all of us. So that's how I'm getting out of the trap of thinking about the specificity of a certain population, as opposed to thinking about a capacious by way of a kind of specificity.
All right. And then Alicia Sharma, first off, wants to thank you all for the conversation. And she says, this conversation is making me think about Toni Morrison a lot. Beloved specifically regarding gender, non-linearity, freedom, haunting, the necessity of abolition, but also how she talks elsewhere about language, the power of language, words, and stories. She's wondering if you have thoughts or feelings around any of this and or Morrison in general that you might want to comment on.
Oh yeah, for sure. Morrison is life, absolutely life. In my apartment, I literally have a framed picture of Toni Morrison there. So actually, I guess I'll reference the quote that I have along with that picture. Morrison says, I forget exactly where she said this, but said that the function of freedom is to free someone else. And those are words to live by. And I think that's very much what Anarcho-Blackness, anarchism, Black anarchism is attempting to do. To whatever extent we find ourselves getting free or in the process of getting free, that means we are then responsible for trying to proliferate freedom for others. And you mentioned Beloved specifically. I recall there's a moment in Beloved, and it's been a while since I've read it, and so I'm forgetting like names and all that, but there's a moment when one character is like on the porch, and then she hears the voice of her grandmother, who's long been dead, and needs to go out into the town full of white people and is like terrified, like cannot leave the porch. And it's like she's talking to her deceased grandmother and saying like, why would I go into town? The white people are there. You always said white people will kill me. And then grandmother says, yes, but go anyway. Like you have to go anyway. That risk, that Denver talking to baby son, thank you. So that risk is in service of something larger. It necessitates, or it invites this kind of radical inclusivity, this radical commitment to bringing about a different way of relating or a different way of living in the world. And that to me is very much the work, and Andrew knows a lot about this, and very much the work of accomplices, that necessity for risk, that we know that these things might kill us, or if we're trying to live via a certain kind of anarchic mood or anarchic modality, we know that a lot of these things will kill us. A lot of the things that we're saying, or a lot of the things that we believe in, or a lot of the things that we enact might get us killed, like protesting, being in the face of police officers, all that might literally get us killed. This is not to say that people need to like have no regard for their own livelihood, safety, vulnerabilities, any of that. This is to say that the work of abolition, the work of anarchism requires risk, and a risk that is deeply, deeply, deeply visceral, but that risk is necessary precisely because the risk will engender the radically different way that we seek to live. And that I'm getting very much from Toni Morrison. She is for me, the master of thinking about risk, thinking about alternative ethics, but in a very loving way, in a way that's deeply, deeply attentive to how people are feeling, how people move throughout the world, what people can or cannot do. That to me, I think is also necessary in this. It's not simply about, we can say you need to do this, but Morrison is deeply attentive to how might you do this in the way that you can. Actually, in her documentary, The Piece of That I Am, which came out shortly before she died, she says, in the context of like people asking, what can I do? Especially people who are like, I don't know, soccer moms in the suburb, like, what can I do? What can I possibly do? And Morrison just says, do what you can where you're at. Like that is, like, you don't have to be someone who is out there protesting in the streets. You can do, like, as long as you're doing what you can, wherever you are, wherever that is, that's the work you're called to do. And if you're doing that kind of work, that I think I'll risk saying that I think can still be considered a kind of anarchic or abolitionist work, even if it doesn't look like even if it doesn't look like people out in the streets protesting the police or protesting prisons and all that, which is wonderful, necessary work. It can look like something else. It can look like talking to your racist, Trump-loving uncle and getting him to chill with some of that, or getting him to change his mind, or influence, if not influencing him, influencing his children or something like that. This is all part of the work. And I don't want to hierarchize or evaluate certain kinds of work over other kinds of work. All of it to me is part of the struggle. And Morrison gives me a way to think about the minutia and the quotidian of this kind of work, rather than simply the spectacular, which is not unimportant, but there are other ways to do the work. And that then means that none of us are off the hook. We all have to do some kind of work. You can't simply just say, I don't know what I can do. I can't do anything. So you do your thing. All of us have to do the work. And that to me is the important part. And Morrison has gifted me with that time and time again.
Beautiful. So beautiful. Holly Stevens has a two-parter for you. Can you comment on your experience in the authoritarian U.S. university system? And also, academic language excludes many people, doesn't it? Does one have to be educated to be an anarchist?
Wonderful question.
Marquis.
Yes, Andrew.
Maybe I can plug one of the articles that you wrote for African American intellectual history. As a way to get at Holly's second question about jargon, right? And that article always made me think in various ways about how, right, like, sure, academia is absolutely a pretentious place in many
100%,
cases.
yes.
Certainly. Well, maybe let's answer the second question, and then we'll get back to the first one. Does one have to be educated to be an anarchist? No. A lot of the work that that people observe in academia is exactly that. The folks who may be theorizing anarchism in some way through anarchist language are often just real good observers of anarchists in the street, abolitionists in the street, who are doing that kind of anarchic work that Marquis was just talking about, whether it's talking with close friends, or even putting water bottles in the street on a real hot day in LA. That's anarchic work. That's abolitionist work. That's anti-carceral work. So no, absolutely not. You do not have to be educated to be an anarchist, and oftentimes, let's just say it's not a prerequisite at all.
And can I chime in real
sure.
quick, and then I'm going to let you continue, Andrew, because I'm loving all this. So even wonderful examples, even to go even more, not obscure, but even less obvious. My grandmother is 70-year-old large Black woman who does nothing but watch TV all day, and I have the greatest conversation in my life with my grandmother. So she loves like action movies, and I've heard her say on numerous occasions that, so you have the action movie and then you have the big fight scene at the end, and then once the fight scene is over, good person beats bad person, all that, then the cops show up. My grandma, without fail, said cops are fucking useless. Like, why are they even showing up? No, we should just, like, all the work has already been done and now the cops want to show up. But that to me is like a kind of proto-anarchist or proto-abolitionist mode of thinking. This kind of interrogation of the utility and efficacy of law enforcement, of the police, and a recognition that the work of combating whatever violence might come about, and I also use violence advisedly because we need to very much reconfigure what we mean by violence, and who commits violence and what violence looks like. But nevertheless, the work of mitigating whatever violence may come about can be done by people who are not the police. And oftentimes, via these movies, are done precisely by the people who are not the police. Police show up to, say, just introduce a whole bunch of other problematic shit. So even someone like my grandmother, who is on the couch all day watching these movies, watching these TV shows, is thinking in terms that can be construed as abolitionist and anarchic. So even that is a way of thinking about how we can do certain kinds of work, or how we can think about things, because my grandmother has been saying that for decades, like actual decades. And that then is instilled into me. And then I enter into spaces. My sister, who is 12 years younger than me, my brother, who is 3.5 years older than me, they also have heard this. And they then are thinking, or are moving through the world with this knowledge that grandma has gifted us, and are affecting other people, are doing different things. So this one 7-year-old Black woman in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who has very little contact with anyone, is having an effect on her 3 grandchildren. And then we are going out into the world affecting other people. That is the kind of work that even small gestures can have. That's the kind of effect even small gestures can have. So I wanted to just add that, but Andrew, you keep going.
Yeah, it's a great example of work that proliferates, right? Mm-hmm. It's work that builds upon itself and goes off and does its own thing, right? And that's awesome. That's really beautiful. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thinking about your article from a while back.
And also jargon for the record, it's called. Now I'm forgetting. Now I'm blanking on the name.
It's
jargon for the blacks. Yeah.
And I don't want to run the risk of mischaracterizing it. So if you want to potentially take on the work of answering Holly's question, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll add what I feel I need to.
Right. So when we think about jargon, right, as a kind of cornerstone of academic language, Marquis says, I understand that you conceptualize jargon as, or rather the want for the elimination of jargon to contain anti-Black sentiment, right? Which is to say that academic work, the folks who need perhaps academic work the most, right, for the purpose of getting more free, right? The argument goes, can't necessarily do so because there's all this jargon in the way. But your argument is really provocative, which is the argument which says that we should eliminate jargon, casts off Black people, poor people, uneducated people from doing the work of understanding, from doing the work of maybe working with that jargon and coming to a better understanding by way of that language. Oftentimes, that one word can provide someone with a critical vocabulary to go out and do all this other work. I'm sure that I slandered it in some way, and so I may apologize. I'm sorry right off the bat. But if you want to clear up anything that I just said,
sure, that'd be awesome. I think you characterized it wonderfully. So essentially, what I'm trying to get at is not a disavowal of the critique that's embedded in a lot of that sentiment. Absolutely, a lot of the stuff that I read. I mean, I was a philosophy major in undergrad. And a lot of that stuff is impenetrable to people who are not trained in this very specific kind of field. That is 100% true. I think what I simply want to, in that article especially, simply wanted to instill or introduce was 2 things. One, that I do not think what is called jargon is always and already bad necessarily, precisely because it might give someone or give people as you said, a critical vocabulary to do something. It also, though, I think and part of this is also that it seems to automatically presume that people outside of the academy, I want to say this as humbly as possible, because I don't want to come off as malicious or hostile, really. But it seems to presume that people outside of the academy can't or don't think. I I know it's going to be difficult. And part of the work, part of the value is that difficulty. Like, why do we need things to be immediately digestible and accessible all the time, and not have to like do the kind of intellectual work that is required of thinking? Like, literally thinking is intellectual work in my estimation, and then not to give a wholesale pass to any kind of impenetrable philosophical jargon that is out there. Rather, it's simply to believe that if a concept or a thing or an idea is liberatory, is doing liberatory work, that I think, or I hope that people even outside of the academy are willing to, and maybe even have already done the work of thinking about this, putting in the work of giving this some sustained thought, looking this thing up, or engaging it, talking about it in another way with other people. So that's part one of this. Part two is that Black folks, poor folks, queer folks have been theorizing for centuries, like have literally been doing this kind of theoretical work, and it's not been called theoretical work. So when we try to denounce jargon, I mean, if you have ever been to like a drag show or an underground queer ball, the jargon in there is just proliferates. It is pervasive, and some of it is now seeping into the mainstream. But like, to read someone or to kiki or the Yas Queen, all those kind of things, all of that stuff is coming from poor queer communities of color, very much so. And that is a kind of theorizing, that's a kind of jargon, it's a kind of specialized language. So there are, I guess the second part of my argument is that there are certain things that are called jargon and certain things that are not called jargon, but are doing like similar work. And I'm interested in how we can think about this kind of language as providing language or access into different modes of thinking that might prove liberatory or freeing for certain communities, certain populations. So I am much less interested in the wholesale denigration of what's called jargon, precisely because people can think. I want to trust people to think, and also that it's being done in, as Barbara Christian says in her essay, her canonical essay, Race for Theory, being done in the form of the hieroglyph. That Barbara Christian says that Black people have always theorized, have always used this kind of specialized language, but in the form of the hieroglyph. So it takes different forms. It looks differently than what we might understand as jargon. So I want to commit to the possibility that specific kinds of language is done outside of the academy, and the ones that are done in the academy can be grasped and taken and utilized for liberatory ends by people outside of the academy. That, I guess, is me being hopeful and optimistic that people can do that work, but I want to commit to that being the case, because to me, like, the language has been deeply, deeply generative and deeply freeing, and has given me and other people too a kind of solace and drive to do this kind of work. So I don't want to denigrate it or get rid of it entirely, which I don't think is what's being called for mostly, especially not in this question. That's not being called for. But I do want there to be a firmer sense of kind of commitment to the possibility that language that might not be immediately identifiable or legible can be worked toward and can have liberatory effects. So yeah, but I say this, I think, a lot more succinctly and clearly in the article, which is on Black Perspectives, called Jargon for the Black. So if you want to know more, go read that, or you can also just email me and I'll give you more words for all of this. So I'm very open to conversing more about these things.
Right. That's beautiful. We have time, unfortunately, for just one more question. I'd love to stay here all night, but Kate's asking the two of you, what was the last thing each of you read that blew your mind or took your breath away?
Ooh, oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Do you want to go first, Marquis, or
Andrew, if you have something readily on your mind, go first. I need to think about it just a little bit.
Yeah. So in the midst of moving and doing various kinds of other things, I've had the opportunity to read a couple just fantastic books. I'll talk about maybe two books and then one article that I'm currently working on. one that Marquis recommended to me is it's called Angry Black White Boy by Adam Mansbach. It's just, I mean, especially if you're interested in fiction, young adult fiction, borderline nonfiction, or let's call it maybe his historical realism. It's totally for you. And it really, I wanted to mention it earlier when we were talking about how doing anarchic or abolitionist work or race traitor work can quite literally get you killed. Marquis was referring to that earlier. And it just made me think, like, when we were talking about Morrison, it's like Morrison recognizes that, like, shit's really real.
Yes.
Like, this shit's real, but like, what choice is there but to go out and try to do something about it, right? And so Angry Black White Boy is just an example of what it looks like when someone who you know, is dissatisfied with whiteness goes out and tries to do something about it. It's a real good book. Second is I'm reading The Devil Finds Work by James Baldwin. Baldwin. So my first and my most wonderful advisor was a student of Baldwin's, and she every time I tell her I'm reading Baldwin, she always gives me this wonderful this wonderful insight into his thinking, and just the way Baldwin writes, his syntax, his grammar, the way he goes about writing sentences into paragraphs, into pages, and it's just awesome. And then third, and I'll stop after this, I'm reading an article in Cardozo Law Review by the law professor Cheryl I. Harris, Finding Sojourner's Truth. And I read it, I revisited it again, Marquis, because when I was reading about Combahee River Collective in your book, it reminded me so much, or rather the Combahee River Collective, I would surmise, learned so much from Sojourner Truth's historiography. And Cheryl Harris is just is an absolutely fantastic and really clear and provocative writer. So I recommend that book that article to everybody, Finding Sojourner's Truth. Those three really just took me for a loop, and I don't think I'm ever going to be quite finished with any of them, even after I put them down.
Agreed. I second all of those. For me, oh goodness, it's got to a point where I read so many things, I just like forget like where one ends and where the other begins. But I do want to try to maintain the distinction, because I want to give the authors their due credit. But I'll name two things. The first is by a friend, colleague, who I mentioned earlier, Jennifer Nash. Her book, Black Feminism Reimagined After Intersectionality, is that book, it really spoke to me at a really deep level. Like she was saying things, or she is saying things in that book that I've been thinking for a while, but have not had language for. Like she is really, and also she is one of the clearest, most cogent writers I've ever encountered. So that book is just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Cannot recommend it enough. And also Jennifer Nash too is just like a wonderful person, like a wonderful, kind, compassionate human being, which is very rare actually to find in the academy. But she is someone who, like, you talk to her and you are like the center of the world. It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. So Black Feminism Reimagined After Intersectionality by Jennifer Nash is one I would highly recommend. The second one is, I just read this. This is the last book I just read. Actually, I'll name a third one real quick. But the one I just read is called Otherwise Worlds. What is the subtitle? Against Settler Colonialism and Anti-Blackness. It's an edited collection of like 20 different essays or articles. And it's edited by Tiffany Lethabo King, Janelle Navarro, and Andrea Smith. That is also a phenomenal collection that gives a whole bunch of different perspectives on the ways that that we must think about settler colonialism and anti-Blackness together, in the way that Black studies and Indigenous studies really converge in some generative ways. So that collection is phenomenal. And then the third one is literally on my nightstand in my bedroom right now. It's called Becoming Human, and that's by Zakiya Iman Jackson, which is a phenomenal treatment of the way that Black feminism, or what Black feminism had to say regarding the very notion of the human, and how the notion of the human is woven through various kinds of discourses of white and cis masculine supremacies. And Zakiya Iman Jackson gives an account of how we might critique, interrogate, and think differently about the notion of the human and how we might get outside of that. So those are the three I would recommend. There are so many others I would recommend though, but yeah, those are, I think, the three that come most readily to mind. So yeah.
And your book as well, Marquis. Come on.
My book as well, yes. My book as well, yeah.
Right.
It's pretty good, I must say. I think it's pretty good. So yeah, my book as well. So yeah, but yeah, thank you. I wanna just thank all of you, Andrew, Josiah. I want to thank Peter too, for being in conversation with me, for all of you for just being here and being a part of the conversation, because you also are constitutive of the conversation as well. This is not just me talking about things, but this is an ensemble of communication and collaboration about a whole bunch of stuff. So yeah, thank you all for being here, for just engaging with me, for all the wonderful questions, all of that. So this was great. I'm very much enjoying this, especially amidst being in South Dakota and being around some really interesting stuff. Having this moment to talk about Blackness, anarchism, and all that has been wonderful and stimulating and sustaining for me. So thank you all for this.
Give it up for our wonderful people tonight talking, and everyone that was here. It was a really beautiful event. I'm going to just quote Adriana here. Thank you, Dr. Bey. This was such a lovely, invigorating, stimulating conversation. Thank you so much for letting us sit and listen. It really was.
Thank you.
It really was. And I want to thank you all on behalf of City Lights Books. And if you haven't bought the book yet, buy the book, please. And to learn more about City Lights and its upcoming event, check out our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram presence online. God, this was such an amazing event. If you all want to see it again, it's on YouTube. If you know anyone who couldn't make it tonight, tell them. Go to YouTube and have them visit our City Lights live webpage. So once again, Andrew and Marquis, I really want to thank you for spending time with us and giving us this knowledge in Medicina. It was a real beautiful evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Era un placer, Josiah. Gracias.
Gracias usted. Gracias. And on behalf of all y'all, thank you for coming in, broadcasting live from Lawrence Ferlinghetti's office. Remember what it says on City Light walls? Printer's ink is the greatest explosive.
I love that.
Buenas noches.
Thank you.
Peace, guys.
Thank you all.